You know, this is the most fun I've had at a public engagement in probably years. So thank you all for coming tonight. I understand there was some weather difficulties for the last few meetings, so it's really exciting that we're here tonight with a packed room to talk about natural medicines, talk about psilocybin, talk about entheogens, to talk about psychedelics. So thank you all for coming tonight. It's quite an honor to be here. The last time I was in this room, I believe it was in early 2019 when I was sitting with some folks from the Libertarian Party of Colorado as they were deciding whether or not to support our initiative in Denver, Initiative 301, which decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms in the city and county of Denver back in 2019. Thank you. That was fun. So it was, really an incredible opportunity to get to meet some more fellow libertarians and have a conversation around why we deserve the right to choose how we heal, and especially to choose how we work with the natural medicines that are available for us to, explore our cognitive liberty and explore our own methods for healing, especially if they come from nature. And so a big part of the reason why, I'm here tonight and have been advocating for psychedelic policy reform, just the last 4 years now, really is because of my own experience using psilocybin mushrooms to get a little bit of leverage on my diagnosis of major depression, which I got about 10, 12 years ago. And so I'm here for our right to heal. I'm here for cognitive liberty. And then I learned a little bit about politics and how it's hard to talk about these things in an official capacity. And, I'm just excited that we can, for me, looking back on the past, especially the past over 3 years now, or nearly 3 years now since we passed the Denver Psilocybin Initiative, just how much this movement to liberate these natural medicines, liberate psychedelics, liberate psilocybin really has taken the country by storm. Show of hands in here, how many of you folks are Denver residents? Awesome, okay. For those of you who raised your hand, how many of you voted yes on our initiative in 2019? Awesome, thank you. Thank you for your support. I'll never forget May 7th, 2019. Our campaign in Denver was very bootstrapped. We were all brand new to this movement. We were brand new to politics. We were brand new to advocacy. For myself, that was the first time that I was a campaign manager. I'd never engaged in policy reform. In Denver, we were the underdogs in a lot of ways. No one had expected that we would even get on the ballot. And so our work in Denver was really an example of what happens when a dedicated and committed and passionate group of individuals come together to advocate on an issue. For those who don't know, only 26 states in our union can citizens come together and initiate an ordinance or create a law. In the remaining 24 states, it has to go through the state legislature, through the powers that be. And so I feel very privileged to be here in this state, which I grew up in. I'm an East High School grad, 2004, by the way, that we have the opportunity to advocate on this issue. And our work in Denver was incredible. I remember our campaign watch party on election night. And I would watch as at 7 p.m. the initial numbers came out for the election. And we were down by a solid 7.5 points. It was like 46.5% no to decriminalize psilocybin, and 46.5% yes to decriminalize psilocybin, and 53.5% no. And then every 90 minutes, we just kept watching that number inch closer and closer and closer to 50%. And at the end of the night, this is 1 a.m., the DJs are gone, folks are taken off. I learned that we still had 40,000 votes to count at 1 a.m. that night. The May 2019 election in Denver was the largest election turnout in Denver's history in 30 years. And I like to think a big part of that was because we had psilocybin on the ballot. By the way, that election went to a runoff for mayor, and decriminalizing psilocybin got more votes for mayor than Mayor Hancock did. So May 8th, May 8th, 2019, after those 40,000 votes were counted, it was 4:20 p.m. when the Denver Elections Board released the results. May 8th, 2019, 4:20 p.m. is when the Denver Elections Committee released the results from their count for Initiative 301, and we had won by about a 0.5 percentage point, which was incredible. And that moment was as if I was peaking on psilocybin and LSD and a whole bunch of things all at the same time. I just remember being in my driveway on the phone with some allies, and then I got a call from a journalist friend of mine who said, "Hey, Kevin, the results are in. You won, you won, you won." And I, hung up, refreshed, and sure enough, it was like 56.4% yet, or 50.64% yes for Initiative 301. So thank you. Yeah. I mean, that's a moment I will always remember. And that moment made history in the sense that we could advocate for our rights to use psilocybin. We could advocate for our rights to use other psychedelics. And I could have never even imagined the amount of impact that moment in history had, not to mention that it was followed very shortly, 3 weeks later, by Decriminalize Nature in Oakland, where they decriminalized all entheogens in the city of Oakland. And so looking back over the past 3 years, I truly believe that we have a deeply populist movement regarding access to natural medicines, access to psilocybin. And at this point, I really believe that 2022 will be a very landmark year for further psychedelic policy reform. So, tonight I'm here to try to not be so long-winded and love hearing the sound of my own voice. I want to share with you briefly about the work that we've accomplished in Denver since May 7th, May 8th, 2019, and then briefly share about the upcoming work that we do have in the state of Colorado to create a legal access paradigm for Colorado residents to natural medicines. So, and then the Q&A part's the most fun for me, and so I'm looking forward to your questions. And so back in November, the Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Policy Review Panel, we released our 2021 comprehensive report to the Denver City Council. So the Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Policy Review Panel, that was formed as a result of our success in Denver. This panel includes proponents of our campaign in Denver, along with members of law enforcement in the city, including our DA, Beth McCann, members from the city attorney's office, members from the Denver Police Department, the Denver Sheriff's Department, and other advocates and mental health professionals and attorneys. And the purpose of the Denver panel was to assess and review the impact of decriminalizing psilocybin in Denver from the context of really safety, health, and fiscal impact. So we initially met in February of 2020, and over the course of about 18 months, we had about 6 meetings. And in those meetings, we brought in advocates and professionals, both from the grassroots community side, also individuals from the medical community, individuals from other professional sectors, to really just educate our Denver panelists on the benefits and also the potential risks of psilocybin. And as a result of those meetings, almost a year ago, in March of 2021, our panel unanimously concluded that decriminalizing psilocybin in the city and county of Denver has not since created any significant public health or safety issue in the city, which was huge, especially considering that we had our district attorney, Beth McCann, who is on the panel. She was initially oppositional to Initiative 301 when we were campaigning back in 2019. And so the work that we did on the panel really shows the potential that's here and demonstrates the overall safety of using psilocybin in a decriminalized context. And it also goes to show how important it is that for those of us who have utilized psychedelics, and especially utilized psilocybin or any of the other entheogens, it goes to show how that when we share our stories about how about how these medicines have impacted our lives, that they can have a real, direct, incredibly positive influence on folks who may otherwise not be supportive. And so I had the real pleasure of watching our district attorney, members of our law enforcement. I can see the look on their face change from when initially they may have been a little bit skeptical, a little bit oppositional, but when they heard these stories of transformation, for example, coming from people who utilized microdosing to work with their alcoholism and looking at the before and after, they finally got it. And, you know, it's indicative of right now in this country, psychedelics really being a part of the national conversation. It's in the zeitgeist, right? People are starting to really understand that as we rebrand away from the stigma of the 60s and the 70s and the Tim Leary messaging of, you know, turn on, tune in, and drop out, which doesn't work, right? That if we can start to have this conversation around how psychedelics can be incredibly beneficial, you know, for mental health, for addiction, for major depression, for treatment-resistant depression, for smoking cessation, for alcoholism, in some cases for opiate dependence and other traumas, PTSD, other dependencies. And then if we're also talking about how these natural medicines can also really help healthy, normal people tap into their creative potential, tap into their community, and really create an environment where where we can understand each other's differences and start to accept each other for who we are, which, you know, very often happens in group settings with psychedelics, then we may potentially have an opportunity to start to really address some of the issues that we're facing as a country right now. Thank you. And here's a really challenging fact that I learned recently. And again, I'm born and raised here. You know, Denver's my home. I spent some time on the East Coast. I was a cadet at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point for a couple of years. I never deployed overseas. I'm a veteran. I'm retired from the U.S. Army. The reason why I left the Army was because I was diagnosed with major depression while I was actually a cadet at West Point. You know, I promptly came back to Colorado because Colorado's home to me. You know, Colorado really is the place where there's so much going on here. The culture here it's still growing. I think for many of us, we're still figuring out what it means to be a Coloradan, especially when, you know, we're this incredible city right in the middle of the country, and so many people are coming here right now, especially when housing prices are so expensive. Why are people moving to Colorado? You know, I'm very curious about that. We could potentially blame cannabis or blame marijuana for that, or maybe the energy industry. I like to think that this is a place where we have an opportunity to heal. I like to think that this is a place that, you know, if we're the mile-high city, then we have the opportunity to start to explore these different modalities of what it actually means to tap into our humanity as a part of nature, because that's what we are. You know, we have natural rights as humans, and we are a part of nature. And I learned recently that Colorado is the worst state in the country. We're the lowest ranked state in the country, 51 out of 51 if you include DC, in terms of the number of adults with mental health issues and the prevalence of access to care compared to other states. So we have the highest number of adults with mental and behavioral health issues and the lowest rates of access to health care. Why? What's going on here in this state? that's actually causing that to be a reality. You know, personally, I like to think that although they're not a panacea, that natural medicines, psychedelics, can have an impact on those rates. And really that's why I'm here today. So in Denver, as I mentioned, 2020 was a big year for psychedelics overall. There's more than a handful of states that are creating some type of legislation either to explore what access can look like or actually creating access. For example, we have California and Decriminalize California, which is actually creating much more of a commercial model around access to psilocybin. In California, we also have Senate Bill 519, which is fully decriminalizing psilocybin and other psychedelics. We have the state of Michigan with House Bill 631. Fact check me on that number. I'm pretty sure that's the one that's going to decriminalize entheogens across the state. Raise the hands, by the way. I've used a lot of terms tonight. Who's familiar with the word entheogen? Okay. And then psychedelics, obviously, we know what they are, right? Okay. So the term entheogen means manifesting the divine within. It's the Latin of the word, the roots of the word. And so in many cases, a lot of advocates refer to naturally occurring psychedelics like psilocybin mushrooms, like mescaline-containing cacti, like iboga, as entheogens, as an alternative to the word psychedelic. Who knows what the word psychedelic means, by the way? Okay. Psychedelic means mind manifesting. And so we're working with natural medicines that generate the divine within and manifest the mind. For anyone who wants to get heady and talk metaphysics, we can talk in the back afterwards. But these are substances, from my perspective, these are medicines from my perspective that remind us of our human nature and remind us of who we are and can help provide a pathway, not necessarily solve all of our issues, but at the very least illuminate and remind us that, that one, we are human, and that two, most of us are probably experiencing trauma in our lives in some way. Who's experiencing trauma in their life in some way? I am. I've got a lot of issues. I'm a human being. I kind of think that trauma may be a byproduct of the human experience in some capacity. And then how much is that trauma exacerbated by the state is a good question. Okay, coming back. Our work in Denver. Thank you. So our work in Denver. So this year, our next meeting with the Denver Psilocybin Mushroom Policy Review Panel, it is a mouthful. I try to say DPMPRP. I don't know if I could say it any other way. So our next meeting in Denver is to discuss the recommendations that we made to the Denver City Council back in November. And those recommendations specifically are, one, to get our multi-responder training off the ground. And so Denver is going to be the first city in the country that is training all 4,000 of our Denver first responders on psychedelic harm reduction techniques, which is a big deal. A lot of the fear or a lot of the concern around law enforcement was like, hey, what happens if we have a person who is tripping on the 16th Street Mall and is having a challenging experience? Law enforcement currently does not necessarily have the tools to safely and effectively address that situation. In many situations, they might shoot that person full of Narcan, slap some cuffs on them, and throw them in the back of an ambulance. And if a person who's having a challenging experience on psychedelics, if that occurs for them and they aren't necessarily causing any harm to anyone else outside of themselves, or they may not be necessarily actually a risk to themselves, that can be an incredibly traumatic experience for them and push them back, push them back in a way that creates more trauma. And so Denver will be the first city in the country that, again, trains up all of our law enforcement personnel on how to effectively respond to individuals who may be undergoing a psychedelic crisis. And then that training can then potentially be scaled to other cities and other states nationwide as well. So that's the first recommendation. Let's get this multi-responder training off the ground. The second recommendation is that we are asking the city to produce public service announcements, educational materials around the safe and responsible use of psilocybin mushrooms. Personally, I imagine a situation where every single City and County of Denver resident receives a letter in the mail that says, hey, want to learn about mushrooms? Here's how to use them safely. Here's how to make sure that you're creating an effective, transformational, safe environment so that you're minimizing the risks and maximizing the potential. I'd love to see that, a portion of the Denver City marketing budget go towards creating flyers for all city residents on psilocybin. The third recommendation that we're making as a panel is to create a reporting system so that we can actually better track adverse events that do occur. Right now in Denver, there's no data on hospitalizations. We don't know if people are actually being injured as a result of their use of psilocybin mushrooms in the city. And, whenever a person is coming in to Denver Health, for example, we know that, doctors there don't necessarily track what substance is involved if a person is, presenting as having experiencing an adverse event related to other drugs. And so we want to track that really for safety purposes, just to make sure that we have better data around that. The next two recommendations are the important ones, and these are the ones that are going to require some kind of legislative adjustment in the City and County of Denver. Personally, I would love to see Denver actually catch up with the rest of the country. There are places like Oakland and Santa Cruz, Ann Arbor, Detroit, Washington, D.C., 3 cities in Massachusetts. All of these other cities across the country, they have decriminalized the personal use and possession of all naturally occurring psychedelics, all entheogens. In Denver is only psilocybin. That's my personal wish, is that we can catch up with the rest of the city. As it pertains to psilocybin, is that we want to make sure that we are also decriminalizing the gifting and sharing of psilocybin mushrooms in Denver, and we're also decriminalizing communal use. So for those who don't know, there's actually a state law that says even gifting a controlled substance could be considered felony distribution. And so we want to make sure the Denver residents are comfortable sharing psilocybin with their friends. And then at the same time, we already know that a lot of people are already using psilocybin mushrooms and other natural medicines, other psychedelics, other entheogens in group settings, in communal settings. A lot of the research, if we're only looking at like clinical research from the past 10 or 15 years, is showing that the communal use, the group use, the structured use of psychedelics in a group setting has a lot of benefits. Those benefits include creating a greater sense of community belonging. Those benefits include a greater sense of creating empathy for your fellow human being, and that research also demonstrates that there's a long-term pro-social benefit to using psychedelics in a group setting. And so we want to make sure that individuals have the freedom, they have the liberty, and they have the sovereignty to use psychedelics in private, use psilocybin in private, in the comfort and safety of their own home or in another private setting, in a group setting, because there's tremendous potential benefit from that as well. And that folks who are already using these medicines underground, especially in group settings, don't have to worry about law enforcement intervention, because no person deserves to go to jail for using something that grows from the ground, like mushrooms. 2 more points, 2 more recommendations in Denver. We want to expand our Denver panel. We want to make sure the Denver panel actually better reflects the diversity in the City and County of Denver. We also want to create more subcommittees that are focused on law enforcement, subcommittees focused on mental health, and also education. And then the last recommendation there is we would like the City and County of Denver to explore what the therapeutic application of psilocybin mushrooms could look like in the city in the context of potentially providing these medicines to individuals who may already be suffering from PTSD, This could include law enforcement. This could include military personnel. This could include creating a research center here in the city, maybe in Anschutz, maybe tied to CU Denver. Who knows? So, as I mentioned, our next meeting is next week with the Denver panel, and we'll be discussing these recommendations and really just laying the foundation for how we're moving forward as a city. Denver and the state of Colorado obviously has a history with this kind of drug policy reform. Right now, we also have, Denver in particular is one of the few cities in the country that is really demonstrating in terms of enforcement or drug enforcement. Denver is leaning more towards treatment over incarceration. And I think that we have a lot more work to do here right now. So that's Denver. And so I'm hoping that by middle of June, maybe the end of June 2022, we're going to have a new state of decriminalization in the city and county of Denver where folks actually have a little bit more freedom and a little bit more choice to work with psilocybin mushrooms, potentially the rest of the entheogens, and know that they're protected and will not be facing any kind of law enforcement intervention. And so that moves on to the last part of my little update here is that we are officially moving forward with the Natural Medicine Health Act of 2022. The Natural Medicine Health Act of 2022 creates a regulated access program, so legal access to natural medicines in the state of Colorado. Natural medicines include DMT, ibogaine, mescaline, not including peyote, psilocybin, and psilocin. In addition to creating a regulated program, it's also fully removing criminal penalties for the use of natural medicines in the state of Colorado. That includes the personal use, personal possession, and the uncompensated or non-commercial sharing of natural medicines in the state. And I think we're going to start collecting signatures here in about the next 2 weeks. We just got some polling data back. We've done 3 statewide polls. And from the polling data, we have a very good understanding of what support could look like in the state of Colorado as we move forward. And from the data that we've collected, it looks like we have a strong majority of support from Coloradans. And, advocating statewide, running a statewide campaign is much different from running a city campaign, especially in Denver. We know that Denver and Boulder necessarily are not going to carry this initiative, especially as we collect our signatures. And we look forward to working in every single Colorado county and building a coalition so that we can not only get on the ballot, but set some incredible precedent here in Colorado with a huge success in November. And there's more that I can share about the Natural Medicine Health Act. Right now you can go to naturalmedicinecolorado.org. That's the website. It's very basic. But at the end of this week, we're making a decision on which one of the 2 initiatives that we've already submitted to the state that we're going to move forward with, and we feel very confident that we're going to have we're going to have the most fun and engaging and incredibly successful statewide campaign that this state's ever seen. That's the intention here. And then we're going to set some very important precedent for the rest of the country after we're successful in November 2022. So I'll stop there and then move to Q&A.
So what does legalization look like? What's the path to get to that, in Denver at least?
Thank you. So the question was, what's the path to legalization in Denver? The way that the law works in the state of Colorado is that we couldn't just legalize in Denver only. In Denver, we could only, and to clarify, decriminalizing, that's more of a catch-all term. What we did in Denver was that we made the personal use and possession of psilocybin mushrooms the lowest law enforcement priority, meaning that like jaywalking is a higher offense than a person possessing mushrooms in public. And so the pathway to legalization in Denver is actually through the state. And so that's what we're doing with the Natural Medicine Health Act. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so you're saying that it's going to be legalization at the state level for psychedelics is what it sounds like?
What we're creating at the state level is a...
I don't know.
At the state level, we're creating a legal, regulated access model. And I think it bears a little bit more explanation. So we're creating a two-tiered regulatory access system in Colorado. What that means is that we're going to be creating rules around offering licenses for healing centers and licenses for facilitators so that individuals can receive natural medicine services at a healing center in the comfort and privacy of their own home or in an approved healthcare facility with a facilitator. And at the same time, we're removing criminal penalties for personal use and possession. And so to legalize it, legalization can really only occur at the state level or the federal level. And the Natural Medicine Health Act of 2022 creates a system for legal access to natural medicines, including psilocybin mushrooms.
What is the pathway to entrepreneurship? One of the biggest challenges in the cannabis industry right now is that we started taxing the plant, and we created pathways for people to be tax collectors for the users of the cannabis plant, but we really haven't given full shrift to the small producers of cannabis for specific health reasons or whatever. If it's all right to be on drugs, but I want it to be all right to sell drugs, and I think that way we have a greater variety, a lot more access to the public, all of the things that good competition brings. But if without that kind of support, I'm not much for the tyrants. It seems like they many times have a tendency to limit access to entrepreneurship. And so I would like to sell drugs.
Rodney, that's a great question. And so I think to best answer that, first of all, we're really, we designed this initiative in many ways from the context of learning lessons from cannabis in a lot of ways, and especially how Colorado really messed up cannabis regulation in a lot of ways. First of all, let me be clear, very clear, that the Natural Medicine Health Act does not create a recreational model for psychedelics right now. Personally, I think that would be a complete and total disaster. We're not ready for that as a country yet. However, from a more structured, health and mental wellness perspective, it's important. I'm excited to see what kind of local economy grows out of this initiative, out of this new regulation. A couple things that we're doing. First of all, we're recognizing the inequities in cannabis, and especially now understanding that in many ways access into the system is hard for a lot of people, right? Because it's very expensive. And so written into the bill, written into our measure, we're specifically talking about how we would like to make it a little bit easier for folks who may be more disadvantaged to actually access the program, to acquire licensing, in terms of considering geographic distribution, of access to plant medicines or natural medicines and access to services. All these things are being considered. And some folks may not like this, but we're actually limiting the number of licenses that any single entity can hold up to 5. And the reason why is because if we look at the psychedelic ecosystem right now, especially from a corporate capitalist perspective, there are a lot of big players who have a lot of money who are just waiting to come into a state where there's some kind of legal regulated access model where they can just dominate the space. We don't want that to happen. We want to make sure that, yes, those entities can be involved, but at the same time, this is a program that will be made accessible to, to individuals to create their own healing center or to acquire a facilitator license, and then really from there have a lot of autonomy in terms of how they're sharing their message and sharing their work, in addition to the training that they'll receive. Does that sort of answer your question?
It all kind of depends on how high that first rung on the ladder is. And when we're talking about things that we can do out of our basement now and associate with our friends now and congregate now, and the only thing we have to do is not get in front of someone with a costume on, right, with a badge, right, and not use deadly force, and we can use these things as propagation for health, happiness, and the pursuits thereof. The only challenge we have, once again, are the authoritarians, and they're like for corporate dictates and efficiencies. So there's problems there, and we see it in cannabis all the time. We're not allowing as many small growers to provide for these very specific ailments that cannabis can help. And I know with my mycologist here, he grows for me, right? And I like that, and I told him I don't want to go anywhere else. I want him to be big, but if it becomes problematic because of state regulations and the obstacles that those regulations have a tendency to put into place naturally for him to continue to grow, then that's something I will oppose vehemently, because it's about freedom as well.
I will oppose that too. That's why we actually included the personal use provisions in our language, was to make sure that the personal use, possession, and sharing of psilocybin is protected. And by the way, we're not setting any limits on the amount the person can cultivate in the privacy of their own space. And under personal use, individuals who have a pre-existing bona fide relationship in terms of offering harm reduction services or offering therapeutic services, they could actually receive legal compensation for those services. But folks, the legal term is remuneration, which means quid pro quo, or basically profit. Folks just simply, under personal use, cannot directly sell mushrooms. But under the personal use provisions, they could create a container where individuals can have access to mushrooms. Folks can share mushrooms. And if people are providing harm reduction or therapeutic services, then they could receive some compensation, which would be protected by state law. Not to mention, I had a meeting today with a representative at the Capitol, and a big challenge that we had is how do we make sure that the state legislature is going to be on board with this? Meaning, once NMHA passes in November, how do we make sure that the state legislature doesn't totally deconstruct it and set their own rules? And so that's a lot of our work right now in terms of building our coalition, is making sure that we're also having very strong conversations with our elected officials and our state leadership, so that when it comes time, once this is successful in November, we can make sure that any further legislation that gets passed regarding NMHA is actually going to really embody and protect the spirit of NMHA itself, and not create less access, at least from the personal use side. As long as the legislators don't touch personal use, we're good. That's it. And so, we have more work to do, and we'll see what happens around it. You can come down to the Capitol with us next year and advocate with us, man.
Hi, my name is Mike. Hi, everybody. I'm coming from the 60s, and when I first heard about LSD and started thinking about it, I saw it as, and the people I hung out with, as a consciousness-raising kind of thing, which I think would apply to a healing perspective as well. And that's the way I pretty much thought about it. Then it was repressed and got a lot of bad press and stuff like that. But then later, I read a book, I think it was Acid Dreams, and it was about the CIA using psychedelics as a way to divert people from the politics, anti-war movement and all that, to sabotage it, to get people into thinking about more internal personal things rather than social things. And you know, I like what you're saying about the healing aspects of it, but I'm concerned about how it could be used as a way, especially in a time where mass psychosis is happening all around us, to steer things in a certain direction. I'm wondering, are those issues that you're concerned with personally, and how you would comment on that?
Are you asking me about like MK Ultra projects and other? Are you asking me about like MK Ultra projects and other stuff in the?
Well,
the 60s
I know about
and the
that, but not
CIA?
necessarily that.
Yeah.
But just that there are powers that be that would use it, like they use the media or use anything that's available. Is that a concern for yours, or an issue for you guys?
Personally, it's definitely a personal, I wouldn't say concern, but something I've certainly thought about myself. Well, I'll just say it like this. There's a lot of people who, and I might get in trouble for this, but there's a lot of people who think that psychedelics and access to psychedelics may be like a Prozac Nation 2.0 kind of a thing. You know, and if you're considering some of the information we have around how the government may have utilized psychedelics in the 60s and 70s to potentially, you know, sway public opinion away from the issues of the time, you know, I have the same questions. Now, personally, I believe that the safe and responsible access to psychedelics is actually a national readiness issue. And the reason why I say that is because we do have a rampant health and mental and behavioral health crisis in this country, which is why it's critically important that any legislation that gets passed here in Colorado and in the rest of the country is protecting a person's right to choose how they engage with this medicine, meaning that a person has a right to pop a pill or eat a plant in the comfort and safety of their own home, in a structured clinical setting, or some other FDA-approved setting. And so I think, you know, especially at this incredible nexus and this time that we're in right now where, you know, the proliferation of information may be causing a lot of mass psychosis in a lot of ways because people can't focus. My hope is that as long as we have the right, you know, opportunities for integration from these experiences in place, then folks can heal and they can start to actually recognize like what's important versus what's propaganda. And so I think time will really address your question more than I can, if that makes sense.
So for you, I mean, do you actually help people? Like, do you work with people who are need healing, and that you talk with them and help them in some way while they're taking psilocybin or something? Is that something is that in your field?
I leave that to people who are much more qualified than I am.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, there are people who are more experienced in that realm than I am in terms of helping individuals directly with, you know, the issues they're facing. I'm a heady policy guy. That's kind of my role in this space right now, is to help educate people and actually have these conversations. Folks who are better than I am can actually sit with individuals and work with their issues.
My name is John. I got really two questions. One involves you said you're going to go more of the health aspect. How does that factor into like red flag logs and 2A? Because a lot of times if they go with the medical marijuana, they're not qualified for own weapons. Could you kind of comment on that?
So can you actually just repeat the question? Like how does the Natural Medicine Health Act potentially relate to 2A laws and what else?
And it's pretty much a Second Amendment on that end.
Okay. I mean, I don't know if I can directly comment on that right now. I mean, I'm a proponent of 2A in a big way. I'm also a proponent of using plants that grow from the earth to help me heal. Folks can read our language and they can see where, we're protecting the rights of individuals to cultivate these medicines at home. And I think, your question may come down to litigation in the future.
Fight for another day or another avenue.
Potentially, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And I actually have one more question. It's really you commented on several other cities that have legalized these types of things. A lot of them are heavily left-wing, just crime-ridden. How is that dichotomy versus those cities versus places that don't have legalization? How are y'all kind of addressing the comments about that? Especially that's kind of one thing I'm coming with, where I see all these other cities, they legalize this stuff. I don't want to live there. Yeah. Versus here, it's not the greatest, but it's actually not too bad here. Yeah. How can y'all address that through your proposals and through your stance?
Well, again, let's just make sure to distinguish decriminalization versus legalization. Just to be fair, right? Like nowhere in the country are psychedelics legal. They're all lowest enforcement priority, so they're decriminalized, basically. Now, I'm personally looking forward to like going to Grand Junction, and hanging out with like the Lauren Boebert crew, even though she is who she is, but to have these conversations with more conservatives, in many cases. And, here's where I'm coming from. It's every single family in this country either has a veteran who's in their family or they have a person who's suffering from some kind of mental health or behavioral health issue. What we've seen so far in the 4 years that at least I've been working in this space is that psychedelics is, one could say, bipartisan. I think I might even lead more towards nonpartisan. It's a human issue more than it's a political issue. And so, in many ways, we're creating a political campaign around this. And so we have to have the resources in place to be able to have a conversation with individuals who may be more conservative leaning, as I think you might be insinuating, which is why, personally as a veteran, and, other, veterans who've actually experienced combat and are suffering from PTSD, those are the individuals who we would really want speaking with our more conservative population. And we have to remember that, Colorado's not California. Thank goodness. Colorado's a deep purple state, right? As I mentioned earlier, Boulder and Denver are not going to carry this campaign. And if we're truly going to live to the ethos that this work with the safe access to psychedelics is a nonpartisan issue, then we want to make sure that we're speaking with individuals who may be on the other side of the aisle. Answer your question-ish? Okay, thank you.
Hi. Just to follow up on this gentleman's comment, I was wondering, do you have any concerns you're doing all the legwork and only to have big corporations come in if you actually get it legalized, let's say even federally, right? Come in and we all saw what happened with the ivermectin thing. It was just too cheap to distribute.
Sure.
Do you have any concerns, or I guess as you go along you'd have to build in some safeguards in that respect?
No, it's a great question. So to piggyback off that question, the psychedelic ecosystem by 2027 is going to be like a 7.6 or $8 billion industry in this country. As of today, it's already nearly a $2 billion industry. There are a lot of biosciences and biopharma corporations that, ironically enough, were formed as like really close after our success in Denver, looking at the, legal medical application from an FDA perspective, from a federal government perspective. And that's the reason why we're doing this work. Again, I believe that 2022 will be a year for landmark psychedelic reform. And what I mean by that is that we're going to see a lot of states create their own policies around access. And from my perspective, we need as many states as possible this year to create this kind of reform, so that when, and this is a good thing too, like when psilocybin is approved by the FDA, for example, as a treatment for depression or other ailments, and it could be accessible through prescription, that's an okay pathway for a lot of people. And from my perspective, I think that we also want to make sure that, at least here in Colorado, we have a state-regulated, mandated access model that's not necessarily dependent on the FDA or some of these other companies that want to, create patents around psilocybin and then offer them to the public and make a huge profit. Does that answer your question?
Well, first off, thank you very much for everything you've been doing. So thank you.
You're welcome, yeah.
And then who at the state legislature have you found supportive or very responsive?
I prefer not to talk about the state legislator at this time.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Perfect. And then for petition gathering, are you hiring a company to do the petition gathering, the signature gathering for you?
We will be hiring a vendor, and we'll be paying individuals to collect signatures for us, yes.
Cool. Do you know who you're working with so far?
I can't share it yet.
Okay.
We're almost there at the point, like this was a great conversation to have, because we're like right at the point of we're just about like a full-on green light. And so I think we'll be moving forward like next week.
Hi. Following the curiosity of their questions over there, I would like to know if you do have any strategy or any thinking process of putting aside the decriminalization, sorry for my accent, but how can we protect this amazing substance from being abducted from the evil forces into society that will not allow the masses to use as medicine? Do you have any strategy on mind? Because I feel that more than worrying about decriminalization, we have to worry of how can we have this in order for most of people have the access to use it efficiently.
Thank you for asking that question. That's why decriminalization first is so important. And especially in how we decriminalized psilocybin in Denver as really a model for the rest of the country. Personal use and possession with no limits on cultivation. We have a long time here. Like, this is generational work. It's going to take some time for the use of natural medicines to be accepted by most of our society and culture. And so as long as we're being aware, I'll just say it like this, like, for all this legislation, we have to make sure that we're remembering the traditional and indigenous use and like the original spirit behind these medicines and protecting that. And what that means is that, again, individuals have a choice. They can either participate in the regulatory program if they want to, but they don't have to, because their right to personally use these medicines and grow them for personal use at home is protected. And so I believe as long as we're protecting a person's individual right to choose how they work with these medicines, and especially making sure that individuals are not facing any criminal penalties for doing so, then we can set that strong foundation that ensures that any further regulation that comes down the road has that as the inception of this work, which is what it was. It was decriminalization first. and like, again, there's a lot of work to do. Like, even though we decriminalize locally in Denver, even though we might decriminalize and create a safe, regulated model for safe access at the state level, there's still work federally to do. There's still work internationally to do. But what it takes is like what we've seen the past 3 years of how individual cities have collectively decided that individuals have the right to use these medicines, and so we got to protect that first, and then make sure that any further regulation is accessible, it's equitable, it's affordable for people, and I think it's going to take some time to really lay that foundation.
So you said that one of your recommendations was to start collecting more data, like around hospitalizations. Is that going to be hospitalizations with psilocybin or from psilocybin?
Are you saying as if a person has psilocybin in their possession while they're going into the hospital? It's a good question. So the intent there would be that medical personnel would say, "Hey, did you eat some mushrooms?" And if the person says yes, then they'll check the box. Is that fair enough? Okay. That's great. And by the way, if they have psilocybin in their possession, they're not going to get in trouble for it.
Thanks so much for your talk. Moving from the political to the personal, can you tell us the story behind your most transformative trip?
Sure. So for context, it's a great question. Thank you. I only use, I microdose frequently. I still suffer from major depression. Like, I wasn't healed completely because of using psilocybin. Kind of the backstory there is that about a decade ago, I was going for a walk in Park Hill, went to Mayfair Park. I'd eaten 4 grams of penis envy mushrooms, by the way. For folks who penis envy is it's home for me in a lot of ways. It's a good strain. So that was the experience that, for me as a person with major depression, I was like, went and hung out in the monkey bars, went down the slides at the playground, but then sat back on the grass and like, I don't know if the clouds actually parted, but it looked like they did. And this voice came in and was like, "Hey, like, you have a lot more control over your diagnosis than you think you do. Like, you don't have to be a victim anymore to your diagnosis, and start to create these small incremental steps to start healing." And like, that was the intuition that I got from that experience. Not the most profound experience I've had though. So without talking about time, place, or manner, sometime in the past year, I went in on 7 grams with our PE friends in a very structured setting with a very good friend of mine who was there as a sitter to just make sure that I didn't, float off into space physically or mentally. I mean, mentally was fine, but physically to keep me safe. And, like, what I learned is that I have a lot more work to do. It reminds me that, like, the story that I share about how I felt healed around using psilocybin it's not unique. There's a lot of people that have experienced this. And there's a lot of people who are afraid to talk about it because of the potential legal ramifications. And for the mushrooms to remind me as I'm in like stuck in a time loop looking at my own death and rebirth all at the same time, like, hey, like, if you really want to walk on this path of healing, then here's like X, Y, and Z. And the big story for me was like, make sure you take care of your body. You're firmly rooted. Your roots go down to the center of the earth and your branches extend out to the cosmos. But if you don't take care of this vehicle and this vessel, then you're going to die anyway. But I mean, you're gonna die anyway, and it's time to really embrace this work in a much more powerful way, so that you can just be a better advocate for it. So I'm still working with that, and that was a solid 8 months ago. Haven't had the urge or desire to go back yet, because I know they're going to be like, hey, dumbass, did you actually do what we told you to do? Or are you just here like, as a roadie again? Like, come on, get to work. So, and like, it raises a good point, right? Like, integration is so critical to this. And so like, what are the actual tangible steps that a person is doing after they have an incredible experience, and whatever insight is received, like, what's the smallest step that's like the minimum effective dose that you can utilize to start to like actually walk the path of this insight? And yeah, so this is a good question. You're welcome.
Congratulations on your success. You just present so well, and you can see how much work you've done to get where you are. So congratulations. I'm wondering about your experience with the pushback from the pharmaceutical industry. This is such a threat, and they are so large. and what is, antidepressants, benzodiazepine, that's huge business that you're up against. What are your plans? Have you already dealt with that to some degree? What are your plans to address the big moneyed interest behind what you're working to do, and how they want to thwart that or stop that?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Okay, in Denver, we had no opposition. We were the black sheep. No one thought we'd get on the ballot. Like the Fox 31 guy, when we went to go turn in our box of 10,000 signatures, was like, do you think you made it? And we're like, yeah, of course we did. And he was like, ha, 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 ha. So, like, people didn't see that coming. It's a much different story now, especially because of how incredibly quickly this movement has spread across the country. Not to mention the fact that we've already had 20 years of clinical research. And that's really in the pharmaceutical perspective, which, again, I want to say is okay. Like, if people want to go into a clinical setting and pop a psilocybin pill to have an experience, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but that can't be the only way to access this, right? We have not seen strong opposition from the pharmaceutical industry yet. And I don't know what potential opposition may show up here in Colorado as we move forward with the Natural Medicine Health Act. What I can say right now is that we have not had any opposition. And there's been plenty of opportunity for opposition to show up. Now, I believe in the power of words, and think that like every utterance I speak is casting a spell. So like again, and this is going to be the most fun anyone's ever had for a statewide campaign, and we're going to be incredibly successful with a landslide victory in November. That's what I'm creating. But I think that all these things can exist together. We have decriminalization. Our Natural Medicine Health Act is an issue of statewide concern. And so we're creating a regulated model in the state of Colorado. And that doesn't preclude the ability for a person to potentially receive a prescription from their medical doctor to undergo psilocybin treatment under the context of FDA-approved settings. So I think it's okay. But again, as I mentioned earlier, for those who don't know, show of hands, Jamie Wheel. Anyone know who Jamie Wheel is? Okay, so he wrote a book called Stealing Fire back in 2018, 17, and he just recently wrote a book called Recapture the Rapture. Would highly recommend listening to him or reading his material. He's the person who mentioned Prozac Nation 2.0. Psilocybin, I believe, at the very least, will be approved by the FDA as a treatment option for major depression, and so that will be there. From some of the conversations I've had with let's just say like CEOs of big companies who are creating psilocybin. They're not very concerned about decriminalization. They may be a little more concerned about statewide regulated access models because it might be coming into their bottom line a little bit. But they haven't had FDA approval yet. And so that's why it's important for us now to, at the very least here in Colorado, get these laws in place so we can create good precedent that is a, competing with like FDA approval. So thank you, long-winded. Did I answer your question? Yes. Cool.
2 last questions. So, I have one concern regarding decriminalization of mushrooms. I'm afraid this can extend a black market because we don't have legalization, we have just decriminalization. And black market can cause much more corruption in police officers, which can start cover not only black market of mushrooms, but also cover some kind of violent crime which was created by black market. Do you see this issue by yourself, and maybe you know some kind of mitigation of this problem?
So it's a great question. The black market or the illicit market around psychedelics is fairly non-existent in terms of like comparing it to the levels of black market drugs with other harder drugs, right? So there's already an underground. Even though psychedelics were highly criminalized back in 1970, there has been an underground market ever since then. And what we've seen in Denver is that when we decriminalized, like one of the things that we had to consider in Denver is like with decriminalization, does that create more of a cartel influence? And we haven't seen that. Arrests were actually cut in half in Denver. There were like 75% of the arrests that occurred with psilocybin included other illicit substances. So we haven't seen an increase in at least as far as I can tell, in black market or illicit market distribution of psychedelics as a result of decriminalization. And, we are creating a legal access model as well. And I wonder if that kind of, there's a lot of folks who believe that we should just legalize all drugs because that would completely cut the black market out of the picture, right? Which, I wouldn't necessarily disagree with, but we have to be incremental. I'm just not sure there's a market for psilocybin on the black market in a huge way. It should. Yeah.
Last question.
Who said that? Who said it's non-addictive? Thank you. By the way, so psilocybin, psilocin, DMT, ibogaine, mescaline, these are all non-addictive substances. They're the safest of all drugs that are used recreationally. You've got alcohol at the very top of the list. The most deadly. With psilocybin at the very bottom. That's right, Rodney. The very bottom. What's that? Well, that's a whole nother conversation. That's why we saw Tim Leary and the fallout from Tim Leary in the 60s, right? What other questions are there?
Yeah, we've got the last 2, I guess. The first one's going to be, have any decisions been made about like fees or sales tax for the healing centers?
No. So if you go on the Secretary of State's website, well, actually, it's the Legislative Council's website. Our language is there. Again, if you go to naturalmedicinecolorado.org, you can read the language. Those kinds of things, in terms of fees and like rulemaking, that's up to the advisory board and the Department of Regulatory Agencies. And so one thing we're creating with, well, 2 things. The Natural Medicine Regulated Access Program will be regulated by the Department of Regulatory Agencies in the state of Colorado. Also, there's a Natural Medicine Advisory Board, which is very community focused. especially in the context of folks who have experience from a religious and scientific, from the religious and scientific use of psychedelics. They're the ones who are going to create the rules. The thing that we have to work towards is that, given that this is a statutory measure, a statutory initiative, is that the state legislature can basically rewrite the language, which is why it's important that we have our allies at the Capitol building to make sure that when this passes in November, right off the bat, we've built a strong coalition of state lawmakers who are supporting this to make sure that we're protecting the integrity and the spirit of the measure. So rulemaking, the regulatory program, all that stuff is going to roll out over a period of about 2 years. And the one thing I may have mentioned it earlier, we're starting with psilocybin in terms of regulated access, and then pending the recommendations from the advisory board, we may add the other natural medicines to the regulatory program. So psilocybin first. We don't want to overwhelm DORA with all these different potential regulatory rules around access. So we're just starting with psilocybin first. So it's a 2-tiered model that could see access to the other natural medicines starting in like mid-2026.
So there wouldn't be any funding changes right now for like regulation costs, not at least not included in this measure.
There wouldn't be any funding changes for regulation costs?
Right, like there wouldn't be any fees associated, decided right at this point.
No, we specifically did not look at taxes or anything. We don't want to touch Tabor. Like, keep that out of this as much as possible. In our fiscal analysis, we saw that it's about an even draw. Initial funding for the regulated access program will come from the general fund, which will then be repaid through licensing fees over the course of a few years. And it's gonna, according to the state, it'll in the first couple of years cost the state as much as the state will make in a similar time frame. But no taxes right now. We don't know what that looks like yet, and that's, as soon as I'm not a tax lawyer or expert by any stretch of the imagination, but we specifically did not want to talk about taxes because we knew that would trigger like Tabor rules, and it's something we just don't want to touch right now.
But fees are another thing.
There will be licensing fees.
Right.
That's
it's not
correct.
decided.
Undecided.
So,
but not exorbitant. They will be, like, in the language it's written that they will be affordable to people.
I like affordability, bro.
Say it again, Ronnie. What?
I said I like affordability.
I think an individual should be able, like, if they want to become a facilitator and get trained, then that shouldn't be too much for them to be able to pay to get the training and to move forward.
Second part of the question is, with psychedelics being Schedule 1, of course, at the federal level, for a while there was an issue with doing research, and then I think it was Johns Hopkins broke through that however many years ago. Will this change anything about research at the Colorado level?
I hope so. I mean, I hope the work we're doing in Denver is going to change research at the Colorado level. But I think, like, most certainly, like, not only looking at, like, observational research, which is it's not clinical, it's not double blind, it's like just looking at like use in general, we can see that. But I would love to see like a Colorado Center for the Advancement of Consciousness Studies that includes looking at psychedelic research, and really exploring more ways that psilocybin can be applied to improve people's lives. We need more research. We know it's safe and effective I can't actually say it's effective for everything because it's still undergoing clinical trials, right? But it's the data suggests that psilocybin, for example, is a great tool. It's much more effective than antidepressants in some cases. But yeah, like let's explore, if we're looking at cognitive liberty, let's explore what's possible here. And I hope that Colorado can really become that, like, just, selfishly, let's have Denver be like one of the locations in the country where we're advancing so much more research and learning more about these medicines.
That's our talk. Give it up for Kevin.
Thank you.